Yeah, so I'm often asked the question, how many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have? How does that compare to other ancient works? It's an important question, and it's important really for two reasons. One, the number and the distribution of manuscripts of the New Testament is key, related to the issue even of textual criticism. Oftentimes, students will approach me from the perspective, well, you've got manuscript A says this, and manuscript B says something else. Therefore, we don't know what Paul said at that point, or we don't know what Jesus said. And that would be the case if you only had two manuscripts. If there were only two manuscripts of Matthew, and one had Jesus say kingdom of heaven, and the other one had him say kingdom of God, you might conclude, we don't know what Jesus said. But we've got more than that, more than two. We've got somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament. If you broaden that to include lectionaries, it's the Bible, but they're not arranged in canonical order. The readings are arranged in the order in which they were being read in the ancient church. Then the number grows dramatically. And in fact, I've even heard one scholar recently say that if you include all the citations of the early church fathers quoting from the scripture in sermons and writings, the number could be as high as even 1 million. But 5,700 is about the number. And if you've got 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament from all over the world, and they're falling into families, and they have readings, you don't really have the luxury of saying, manuscript A says this and manuscript B says that, so we don't know what Jesus really said, or we don't know what Paul really wrote. That's just not the case. We do know what he wrote. He wrote one of these two things. And in the vast majority of cases, the difference between A and B is pretty insignificant. Textual critics pay attention to it, but in terms of what was Paul's message, what was Jesus really saying here, it's not a big issue at all. The other thing that's important, other than just the sheer volume, the sheer number of manuscripts, is how does that number compare to other ancient works? And if you look at various critical editions of works like the Iliad and Caesar's Gallic Wars and even Beowulf, you find there's nothing even remotely close. You think about this in two categories. Number one, how many witnesses do we have? And number two, how close to the time of the original writing are those witnesses? For example, there's about 650 copies of the Iliad in existence. And that seems like a lot, and it's enough to produce critical editions. But when you compare it to, say, the volume of manuscripts we have in the New Testament, it doesn't even compare. You've got Caesar's Gallic Wars, which generally is considered to be fairly historically reliable. As far as I can tell, there's only about a dozen copies of it in existence. And the earliest of those copies is probably 1,000 years after the event. And again, that's not the case with the New Testament. In fact, what we find that many of those New Testament manuscripts, the ones that we consider to be the most reliable, are among the most ancient. We've got complete copies of the New Testament in the 4th century. Names that you've heard probably bandied about, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, date to probably the mid-4th century. But there are manuscripts even earlier than that. There are manuscripts that go back to the 2nd and 3rd century. We have a manuscript that's called P75 that's very similar to the text of Vaticanus, and yet it wasn't copied from it, and it's 200 years older. And these ancient papyri have survived, in part because of the climate in which they were preserved. But we've got manuscripts that go back to within 100 years even of the events, and within decades, perhaps, of the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. There's a manuscript that's designated as P52 that's dated by some scholars as early as 125, probably 150, give or take 25 years. It's a fragment of the Gospel of John, and it was found in a library in Egypt. And so that pushes the date for the writing of John back. It pushes the dating of the writing of the Synoptics, which is almost universally held to have been written before John, back into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And there's no ancient work that can boast anything close to that. You've got Tacitus's Histories in the Annals of Imperial Rome. I think there's 2 or 3 copies of that in their 9th and 11th. They're medieval manuscripts, the era of monasteries. Beowulf, as far as I know, there's only 1 copy of Beowulf in existence, and that's just not what you have with the New Testament. That with the New Testament, you've got a widely distributed number of manuscripts from all over the world, from Byzantium and from Caesarea and from the West and from North Africa. You've got it very quickly translated into languages like Latin and Coptic and Syriac, and they're all over the world, and they have a fairly uniform they have an entirely uniform message, and they have a fairly uniform text, to the point where the differences are significant to scholars, but not significant for interpreting meaning. If you have a manuscript of the New Testament from Byzantium or a manuscript of the New Testament from North Africa, you're not going to compare those two and wonder, I wonder what Paul said. You might have some questions about the long ending of Mark or about the woman taken in adultery, but the geographical distribution, the distribution of age, I think gives great credibility to the transmission of the New Testament into the modern day.
Great, great.